Greetings, my friends. This is a service mostly for close friends, and the vast majority of them is English-speaking, while I have quite a considerable number of German-speaking friends, what calls it such, online. But I was asked repeatedly about my experiences on and in Japan. Now, this is something was on the fence whether I would write about it or talk about it, but then writing has not become my medium of choice anymore. It takes a long time. If I could just speak, dictate, and then it becomes a text, there is a possibility actually, not Google, what was it? Yet, and again, yes, Google Chrome has a function where you can open documents and then you can dictate, and in a moderately good quality it records, but you have to talk slow and you have to correct it, and there's quite a lot of work. And then reading a text is always, you have no way to emphasize things as you have with voice. So my medium is far more speaking than it is writing. Anyway, for your friends who asked me or had curiosity or just were interested for any other reasons, I wanted to speak a little bit about Japan. Because I was in Japan twice, about 6 to 8 weeks, I don't remember it exactly, it is quite a long time ago, in 2003, in a summer month, and the first impression that I had from Japan was it is blazing hot. Now, especially for my American friends, it might come as a huge surprise, but most countries in Europe, especially no one here in Germany, has, what is the term? Not cooling, air condition. Right, air condition. Air condition is one of those wonderful, strange English words, because I know, of course, what those words mean. Like, I know what air is, that is the thing that surrounds you, invisible, and you can breathe it most of the time. And then a condition is like you have a condition. Like, you have the China bug, I'm sorry. Not supposed to say the word. Words are taboo again. Strange that in the 1980s, when I was a teenager, we felt the times were much more conservative and strict and controlled, but there were no taboo words. That is something that our most liberal times have the irony of having brought forth taboo words. And if you want proof for that, just look at the movie from Mel Brooks, Saddle Up. Just a small side note, I'm sorry. Anyway, it was blazing hot, and I was not used air condition from Germany, partially because energy prices, that means electricity, are enormous, and they had been not so much during the 1980s, 90s, and the early 2000s. They've exploded now. I believe Germany has the highest energy prices, at least in Europe, maybe in the world, thanks to our not really thought through, over the top, fast, forced change to green energy. Mind you, not that I am against it in a general sense, but making it in a very fast way, as is with young and, let's say, people who do not think things through. They just overnight try to get rid of all the evil energy and replace them with the so-called good one. And the result is, unfortunately, that our energy prices are astronomical, and they had been quite high even then in 2003. So even if a German had the idea to have an air condition for the hot summer weeks. It's not very hot in a very long time in Germany, but hot enough for some time that you would start an air condition a few weeks in the year, or maybe 2 months in the year, sometimes at the hottest days. It is something that was profoundly and totally unknown other than from hearsay. And having grown up in quite a green left-wing environment in West Berlin, for me, like for many people, air condition was the very manifestation of evil. No, seriously. I know that for many Americans that's hard to believe, and I haven't yet heard, interestingly enough, even in our divided times, I haven't, interestingly enough, so far, even the most radical left-wing green politician in America talk against air-conditioned machines. Maybe they haven't, I just haven't heard it, though I follow American politics because they are so fascinating and interesting these last years. But I have not heard that. Probably because when I watched on a globe and watched on the, what is this? I never know entirely what longitude and latitude. I suppose latitude is the horizontal lines. So America is quite on a lower, more southern area in the globe, closer to the equator, as is Japan, whilst Germany and Europe is quite much more to the north. So generally speaking, as a German and as a European, we are used to much more mild climates. We have no strong winters in most of the areas here, unless you go to the eastern area. But especially here in central Germany, and speaking of Berlin, there are no vast mountain ranges, wide and far, which could gather clouds. So, while there is some considerably warm summer, there is no real strong winter, no thick snow in this area around Berlin and the surrounding states. So I was not used to weather extremes. For instance, we have no monsoon rain, which is something that is quite frequent in Asia, that you have extraordinarily strong rain, which lasts for hours and hours, especially in the late summer months. So we are Europeans. If you are German, if you're Central European or generally European, you are blessed with probably among the most best types of weather. I'm not saying this to brag. I'm just saying this as a relation that the first thing I noticed very strongly was Japan had a considerably more extreme weather. We have no typhoons. We have no earthquakes. We have no volcanoes. Nothing the like. So if, as a European, you move to other continents, it is usually quite the first shock that you notice is usually always, at least after a time, the weather. And so the same it was for me. The summer in Japan in 2003, I cannot say, I'm not the expert enough to say it is unusual. I was told it was the usual summer. And the summer was so unbelievably hot that I really remember, despite initially I was quite left green at the time. I mean, in 2003 I was, let me think, 32, if I remember and count correctly. So I was quite very long, almost a child yet. And so I was really fleeing from any climated room to the next whenever possible. The buses are climated, the bookshops are climated, the groceries are climated. Really any public room where you can enter is climated, artificially made cold. And the interesting thing is, which was quite a sort of annoyance, to be honest, is I'm not certain. I would really like to know if that is the same in America. They made the air condition not just to cool down the room to a normal temperature, where you say, okay, I'm rid of the blazing heat. No, they cool it down, and you feel, if you spend more than 20 minutes in those buses or rooms, you feel like you are in a freezer, really. Like it's like winter. You have this desire to take your winter coat and pull it over, because it's like going from one extreme to the other in terms of heat, which is, honestly said, not quite a pleasant experience, because you would assume if you flee from the blazing heat of Japan on Honshu, which is the main island, quite in the center. I was spending most of the regular time in Tokyo, Yokohama. I was living in Yokohama. The district, I suppose, was Tsurumi, and I think that too was the name of the station. It's not such an interesting area, but the way I got to Japan was both times by invitation, and both times my Japanese friends entirely paid for it, because even then I wouldn't have afforded either a flight, because the flight from Berlin to Tokyo is enormously expensive. And I had the fortune to fly with the best, what is the name, with Lufthansa and with the other time British Airways. It was just second class, because first class would really require millionaires. But I can still tell you, one of the first impressions began before I ever was in Japan, because first you must know, for reasons, because Berlin is really a backwater town of the worst kind in ways I can't describe and I don't want to bore you with, but the reality is that you can't fly from Berlin to Japan. There is no direct flight. So what you always have to do is you have to fly to some real European metropolis, which in my cases were, I had 4 flights to Japan in my 2 times I was there. Let me think. I know it was one time London and one time Vienna, the capital of London and the capital of Austria. I'm not certain if it was the other times as well, but it may or may have not been. So anyway, as living in the capital of Germany, you can't fly to Japan. God knows only why. It was not such a hassle, so it was, on the other hand, a welcome break, given that the flight from Berlin to Japan, or more precisely to the Tokyo airplane, no, Tokyo, no, I don't know the word now, to Tokyo Narita. I'm certainly and definitely butchering the word, but having been in Japan and seeing how Japanese butcher English, I don't really have a bad conscience about that. And that is the second most striking thing I found in Japan. You know, in Japan, I heard from many Japanese to which I talked to that English is essentially mandatory. So every child in Japan learns English, but the reality is nobody, virtually or almost literally nobody in Japan speaks English. They speak something that they believe to be English, but I am not an Englishman, as you can probably hear. I am a German. So I assume that my English is capable enough to have a normal conversation, like asking for the way or going to a grocery or whatever have you, or talking about the weather or whatever it is. But the problem is you can't with Japanese. They don't speak English. They speak something which I have no idea. It could be the language of people from Mars, or some whatever it is. It's incomprehensible, and for that reason they are quite aware of it. By the way, so when you ask them something in English, they usually smile. These very polite smiles, and then they say the two or three English words which they presume that they can pronounce correctly, or which most of the time you don't understand them any better. This was especially terrible when I was, after my first 6 or 8 weeks in Japan, more holiday than really a spending of time. When I was, my friend was quite considerably ill at the last 2 days, so he instructed me quite well, and I had gotten around Tokyo and Yokohama, so I was confident to find the place to the airport myself. It's not really difficult. The underground railway system in Tokyo Narita is quite developed, and they have signs in English, so it is not really difficult to find. Their line system is quite confusing for a foreigner, but it's all right. You can learn these things. It's really not that difficult, even though the problem remains. You cannot ask anyone for directions. But I was more adventurous, so probably than I would today at the age. So I got around. So, and I just had to drive with 2 underground lines to a station, then go to the most famous Shinkansen, which is the high-speed train, and then this line of the Shinkansen practically drives nowhere else than to Tokyo Narita, which is the great airport, and it's really a tremendously great airport, quite far out of Tokyo. Now, you have to know one thing. Maybe you look it up in a map. There is a map comparing Tokyo Yokohama to the size of England. Now, one fact you have to know, though, while Tokyo and Yokohama are 2 independent cities, they both have their mayors, they're like independent cities in the same way, like, I don't know, New York and Chicago, or London and Manchester. But the point is, they are side by side, and they are, if you look at them at a map and don't know which is Tokyo and which is Yokohama, you have the impression they are one big city, which essentially de facto they are. And I have no idea how many people live there, and I'm not going to look it up, but let's just say the sheer size, if you put it on England, I meaning England, not Britain, if you overlap it on a map of England, it fills a vast portion of the entirety of England. That gives you an idea what a tremendously big urban area Tokyo Yokohama is. That's why I usually speak it as a double city, as Tokyo Yokohama, even though technically they're separate cities. They're just grown together in one big city. Now, the first time I was there was about, as I said, 6 or 8 weeks in the summer, blazing heat, but it is beautiful. Japan was by far the most farthest away that I've ever traveled, unlike my habit since then, partially because I totally lack money. I also lack any connections. I have not traveled much. As a matter of fact, me being in Japan in 2006 was the last holiday, so it wasn't entirely a holiday, but so to speak, because in 2006, in my second time in Japan, I was there half a year, and I did some minor jobs, teaching English to people or basic English, shall we say. So got a little bit of money, but still the majority of my spending there was paid by, my friend in Japan was not just a regular friend, he was my boyfriend. He was very close and dear to me. He died just a few years after my last stay in Japan from throat cancer because he was smoking 1 or 2 packs of cigarettes every day. It was quite heartbreaking to me, but honestly not really unexpected. He lived quite an unhealthy lifestyle, which is one of the downsides in Japan. For reasons I hope, if I remember it correctly, I will come back later. Now, anyway, and his father had been a quite high judge in Japan, so his pension was quite considerable, and they largely paid the if you think going to Japan, you either have to know someone who is really rich and is paying for you, or you yourself have to be rich. Because let me tell you one thing: Japan is not a holiday country. I mean, I heard that Koreans and Chinese, especially the more rich ones, now make Japan some sort of short trip region. But by and large, one of the most striking things is that Japan is, to this very day, speaking of my experience until 2006, but I suppose it has not changed considerably, Japan was the most ethnically homogeneous country that I had ever seen and that I had ever heard of. In part, it is, of course, because Japan is an island nation. It is made up of 3 main islands. The center one is Honshu, I believe. That is the vast mainland in the center. And that is to the north, the more scenic area of Hokkaido. I've not really learned to pronounce these things properly, and I pronounce them in a way that Westerners understand it. Hokkaido is originally was a place where many of the indigenous people of the area lived, the so-called Ainu. I have no idea how they fare in that region currently. Hokkaido is a snowy, cold region in winter, so it is sort of like Japan's Bavaria, if you want, in many ways. It is supposed to be a little bit outlandish, different than the rest. I never was to Hokkaido. All my time I spent was on the mainland Honshu, and then there is a third larger island to the southwest, who for the all means I can't remember quite now. And then there are, of course, Long Island. And the interesting thing about Japan is a country which is more, if you think of a map, it is a long worm-like form from north to south. And the result of it is that Japan has a lot of different climate zones, which is relatively unusual, actually, at least for European terms. I suppose even if you are an American, if you have one of the American states, you have an idea of a general climate of such a state. Usually the globe projection, which is our, I think, Mercator projection, does not really reveal how long Japan really is. And you have to have special maps to highlight that Japan from north to south is really extremely long. So they live really a lot of different climate zones. And the second striking thing about Japan is almost entirely in the center, in the middle of it, filled with high mountain ranges. So the problem of Japan is it has quite a high population number. I think, if I remember correctly, 130 million people. And the livable land and the usable land, so where you can do agriculture and where you can build cities, is considerably small, given the huge number of mountains in Japan. Given all these conditions, the Japanese have made quite a lot of their country. I must say that. That is another expression. And speaking of countryside, in my first stay in Japan, in these 6 to 8 weeks, I spent most of the time being shown around Honshu, the mainland. So I can't remember every place. I mean, it has been 17 years ago now. And unfortunately, which I much regret today, I was not much of a photographer that day. And it was just the time before smartphones became fashionable. So today everyone has a smartphone going around, and those smartphones have really high quality capabilities for photography, which wasn't the time back then. I had one of the early models of a digital camera with me, quality of which was not so brilliant as the photography is today. And there is a second thing which is quite sad in hindsight, because you see, back then I regarded myself as extremely ugly. So I did not wish to appear in any of these beautiful scenic pictures I took. So the result is that in 98% of all the photos which I took, I'm not in it. It is just the landscape you see, the buildings, the sites, whatever have you, which is quite a little bit depressing, thinking in hindsight people could look at it and say, oh, anyone could have taken those photos. Were you really there? On the other hand, I'm still think I would not even today have the desire to see myself all the time right in the middle of some wonderful Japanese castle or park or high-tech city or what have you. But that's a little bit just beside the point. Japan is a country unlike any country which I had seen. And trust me, unlike my hermit-like lifestyle I had for the last 17 years ever since then, my journey... let me see. 2006 was my long stay in Japan, and it was the last time I had traveled until 2 years ago. Some really kind people from YouTube financed me a holiday to Poland, which was quite a wonderful trip, by the way. So I had, 12 years, 13 years, something around that time. I wasn't on any holiday for such a long time, which is quite a depressing thing, which I did not expect. But before 2006, I had been on many holidays. I had seen mostly European, North African, and a little bit of Arabian areas. But especially within Europe, I had seen many countries and many places. So it's something that people don't know about me. So I had, shall we say, reference to different cultures. I was in Spain, I was in France, I was in Scotland, I was in Wales, I was in England, I was in Swiss, I was in Austria, I was in Italy, and was in Denmark. The few other countries I just can't remember where I all was. So I expected to be prepared to see different cultures. But honestly, as a German and a European, traveling to Japan is like traveling to another planet. Seriously. And one of the main reasons is the extraordinary, exhausting and really abysmal long flight. Now, personally, I enjoy flying. I have no fear of flying like some people have. Though the first time I was flying, it was a little bit creepy to start, but it got away quite quickly. And one of the most striking, beautiful features of flying to Japan was being in 10 kilometers above the world and looking down at the Himalayas. It was a clear day, so I took a photo out of the window I was sitting at the window side at the first flight, and it was really a breathtaking to look down at the world 10 kilometers below, knowing there is the vast stretch of the Himalayan mountains below of me. That was quite extraordinary. So anyway, but still, I was confined to this second class plane, which is quite confined, I can tell you, because they want to milk every penny as much as economically possible. So you're sitting there like a sardine put in a can, and a few hours, it's all right. I was flying to Munich was one of the other of the four places where I had to change the plane. I was at the airport at Munich, I was at the airport of London, I was at the airport of Vienna, waiting for the transcontinental plane. That was a welcome rest, so to speak. But afterwards, I was 11, 12, 13 hours, something around that, confined in a flying sardine in the air. And no matter how wonderful the sight from the windows is and how beautiful the Lufthansa service is, I can tell you, around after hour 6 or 7, you seriously feel like you would rather die than have another hour in this extreme, loud and cramped confinement. I mean, that is the thing, flying to Asia from Germany. I remember the husband of my sister, which is strangely in English called my brother-in-law, which is, again, one of those really funny English idioms, because, I mean, he's not my brother. I'm not in law, because if he married my sister and if he was my brother, that would mean that my sister had married my brother, which is quite an awkward way of phrasing things. Anyway, so my brother-in-law, meaning my sister's husband, is Korean, born in Germany, but to Korean parents who came here, I suppose, in the 1960s. Quite kind people. The mother has died years ago. The father is already extremely old, beyond 80. Quite a frail, but quite a kind man. I really like him. Though I must say I don't understand a word he's saying. It is maybe because of age, maybe because in his job he made never a great effort to learn German, which is a little bit a pity, but he's a kind and friendly person. Anyway, I remember from my brother-in-law and his father that when they're visiting relatives in Korea, that their flight was even longer, like 14 hours or something like that. And being confined in a second class, and second class is really tight. You sit essentially like in a bus. And if you drive by bus like through Berlin, you're sitting in a bus which is really full for about an hour. That is almost more than I can take. And then imagine the same 10 kilometers in the air for 12 hours. So though the start was quite an unpleasant experience. And I mean, on the other hand, you can maybe, I don't know. In the past, people used to travel overseas by ship, and I just listened on a YouTube channel of someone, a Japanese, who was traveling first to France and to England in 1775 or something like that, and his traveling overseas took months. So of course I would prefer an airplane. It is still quite a disappointment. The older generation might still remain the hypersonic airplanes like the Concorde, which would have shortened. And it is one of those deep disappointments that some areas, when I was a teen, I was in the 1980s, I was very interested in technology, to a degree I still am, and that we still have so not really faster ways to fly and more comfortable ways to fly as we imagined back in the 1980s is quite a little bit of a letdown. But I haven't yet talked about Japan much, I'm sorry. Just making this as a story. I hope you have some enjoyment about it. So I was expected there. I was shown around in my first day in 2003. I met the wonderful, kind and friendly parents of my host and my friend, though I wasn't quite aware how much they knew about our relationship. Though I assume in hindsight, they did know, but didn't. It was okay to them. One of the most interesting things, if you talk to older Japanese, which I never could do myself because I knew only a few phrases about Japanese, or let's say I knew back then. Most of them I have forgotten now. So the 90% of conversation was doing through his translation. And knowing him, he was a very honest translator, so he would not lie to me or make things more harmless or beautiful. Partially of which is he lived in Germany for 3 years and took, of course, a habit to be, shall we say, a more forthright person. So, and the thing is, almost virtually every older person, let's say above the age of 50 back then, was really welcoming and overwhelmed with pleasure when they learned that I'm a German. And literally every single one of them, especially those beyond 60 of years, greeted me as, "Oh, welcome our old allies in war." And if you know anything about Germany, I suppose it is the most unlikely thing any German would say, because we have this cult of guilt in Germany. Now, of course, feeling responsible for the past is generally not a bad thing, mind you, but it has become, how shall we say, something of a mental illness of many Germany. I must say it in that way, and I mean this in absolutely seriously, that there's a fixation on guilt-tripping yourself and guilt-tripping ourselves and guilt-tripping every other Germans, a super negative fixation, where the Japanese have a more easygoing and being welcomed as one of our oldest war allies by especially the older people, sometimes also by younger people, was really something I had a hard time to cope with, to be honest. But it was a very friendly welcome, and you have to know the Japanese are generally not very open-minded about foreigners. I mean, they are aware that European culture was advanced in many ways, and they had learned from them, especially during the Meiji era, which is too much of history to comment on right now. So they have a generally fond view on white people, especially on Western Europe, on people from Western Europe and from America. I'm not so certain about their views about Canada and Australia. That much I have no idea. But of course, America, they have a very positive view about America, in part because despite the gruesome war between Japan and America, they found reliable partners both in economy and military in the United States, because Japan, partially of course their own history, is surrounded by countries which, shall we say, not look too well upon Japan. And that just recently had changed a little bit in one case, because there is now much cultural cooperation between Japan and South Korea. Because South Korea is in a similar predicament than Japan, being confronted by a vast a communist empire, namely China, which threatens to expand in the area, much to the danger of both South Korea and Japan. So Japan and South Korea have just recently found that they have a mutual interest. And I suppose, from what I've heard, that their economic cooperation has strengthened, and also in cultural aspect, they are somewhat similar. For instance, in Japanese language, if you address someone in Japanese, you do not just say, how shall I say it? In German, I suppose, as in most European languages, the way you address someone, like Mr. or Miss, Herr or Frau, is not indicating any difference in honor or different in status, while any sort of form to address another person in Japanese, and also I heard this about Korea, is strongly influenced by who you are in relation to the other. So, for instance, one of the most easy to explain area is in school and in family. So there is not a single word for brother or sister, but if you have a sister which is older, I don't know the word for older or a younger sister. Let me think if I remember. So there is one word for older sister, and there is one word for younger sister. So if you call your sister, you're not just calling, hey sister, come here, but you say younger sister, whatever the word is. And that extends also to people who are not your blood related, but people in school. For instance, Japanese have this extraordinary habit to always call themselves by their surname, and only your close family, like your brother, your sister, or your parents, or very, very close lovers who are together for a very long time, are really calling themselves by the first name. And the interesting thing is, transitioning from being called by the surname to the being called by the first name is a very intimate thing, and something that is accompanied by a great amount of feeling embarrassed at the first time. So it's quite a huge step, which is quite normal for us, by calling each other by the first name without any suffix to indicate the hierarchy. For instance, even the youngest school boys, they are expected to call themselves first by the surname and then by a suffix which indicates their rank. For instance, let's say the surname of of a person I know in school is Yamamoto. Let's just say some name, I don't know. Yamamoto. So that is his surname. And his first name is, I don't know, Akira. So in German we would say his name is Akira, what did I say? Yamamoto. Akira Yamamoto. Like someone is called John Whittaker, so, or whatever. But in Japan, first if you ask what is their name, they say their name reverse in the order. So they do not say John Whittaker, but Whittaker John. Or not Heinz Müller, but Müller Heinz. And that is the norm. the same. I suppose it is the norm in South Korea, just the same. And they address themselves then, even if they are 12 or 14. So even if they're young, they address each other by the surname. So they are not called Akira, come here, we want to play soccer, football, or baseball, which is the most likely in Japan. Baseball is quite popular in Japan. But no, you call them by the surname. So they would say Yamamoto, the surname, let's play baseball. And they would not even say Yamamoto, but they would be expected to say a suffix which indicates the relation between you and him. So if you are older than Yamamoto, you would have to call him Kun, which means that indicates he is first younger, and being younger, he is lower of status. That is especially in schools and universities, and also in corporations. Quite to be expected. If you are younger, you are a kun, especially in male. I'm not so certain how it is in female. I have to my shame admit I don't know that. But it is the same principle, I don't know the words. And on the other hand, if Yamamoto is older, let's say I'm in class level 2, and he's in class level 3, I am supposed to address him as Yamamoto senpai, which is the older one. And I know that in Korea it's the same. I seem to remember you address older people, older colleagues as sanbei, and I suppose the word for the younger ones is hobei, at least among the males. So, and that goes far beyond that. So the way you address someone and the way you speak to someone in general is always how is the hierarchical relation between him and you. It is not who you are or who he is in and in itself, but how's your relation. So the Japanese society is a society where language is quite largely determined what your relation to the other person are. For instance, Japanese are taught how far to bow. You know, they're greeting themselves with bowing. If it is an informal, friendly person, you can just nod your head. And the greater the social distance between you and that other person is, the deeper you have to bow. And they learn the degrees to how far they have to bow. In terms how great in status and age the person is different from you. And sometimes, of course, if the occasion, if you have to apology for a grave mistake, you have to bow deeper than it is as a regular greeting. And it goes deep within the language. For instance, given on your age, you can refer to yourself in different ways. For instance, young people can use the word I or myself or me in a more rude or boyish way. Like a boy can refer to himself as ore or boku, while I suppose boku is supposed to be a little bit borderline rude. So if you call yourself in a school boku, like I boku doing this and that, or I boku am of this and that opinion, which is city slang, and you go to a more conservative rural country, they will look at you quite outlandish that you use such a rude word on yourself. And then when you grow older, it is just a male thing. Just male Japanese are supposed to refer to themselves as boku or ore, which is a more, how shall I say it, a more crude way to speak, to refer to you as yourself, which is absolutely taboo for women. women are only supposed to use the honorable proper way to refer to themselves, which is watashi, and there is even an old-fashioned, more conservative, more honorific, which is watashi. But that has become quite unused, or so I have heard. So Japan is a society in which gender roles and the relation in the gender roles, age difference, and hierarchical difference is ingrained in the very language, not just in these small examples, as I said, but in many ways. Like if you are polite, you can say regular forms, and then there are language forms of Japanese which are more polite or even more polite. So how much the language you can express how much you, shall we say in a Western perspective, degrade yourself in front of the other person. And sometimes you just do this to achieve something. Because if you bow down very deep, if you use very forms of language which are seemingly heightening the distance between you and the person addressed, on the contrary, you sort of encourage or force the other person to respect you in kind. So if you really bow down deep and use a very polite form, the other person has, on the other hand, the great social obligation to respond and not say, oh, you're an asshole, and you're like in European cultures, if you would denigrate yourself in such a way, it would usually be laughed or be a reason to put you even down further, while on contrast in the Japanese culture, it would be quite unexpected and quite rude behavior of the person above you to not do a gesture to lift you up. So, or if you plead someone in a very lowering your status by language and by gesture, it is very hard for a person of higher status. It becomes harder socially to say no. So they are expected, on the other hand, to respond in kind. So it is a both-sided thing. This is one of the most interesting aspects of Japanese culture, and it is ingrained in language. So they cannot speak in a way like if you speak German, if you speak English. Of course, you can add polite words, like dear esteemed gentleman. So you add words like dear, like esteemed, to the word gentleman. And then you add please, can you. So you add words but in Japanese you use entirely different words. And that is so deeply ingrained in the language itself that it is impossible in Japanese not to think hierarchical. It is part of Japanese society. Though in recent terms I have been told by people from Japan, it is not so strong anymore. Like, for instance, if you watch anime from the 1980s, 1990s, that you see that especially those who describe everyday Japan, not those with Gundams or airspace or what have you, but to describe, let's say, school stories or stories of workplace. In the 1980s, 90s, you see in these animes still a strong hierarchical behavior, and I have told that this has to a degree lessened. It is not that strong. And that is, of course, as my friends back then told me, a strong influence from Western societies. Though it is ingrained, it is such an essential part of Japanese language that in itself it will likely never go away. This is one of the most interesting differences, and it is, as I said, a two-sided thing. So if you lower your own status by bowing deeper, by using more, heightening the status of the other and lowering yourself, your own, by use of words, by using of a certain language, you on the other side is expected to respond in kind and not to act arrogant. Not that this never happens, but it is generally expected, and a person of higher status who does not respond to this in a positive way is in a great risk of so-called losing face himself. So it is sort of like a dual expectation, which is quite an interesting and fascinating way. This is why I said that visiting Japan is almost like visiting an alien planet. And the most interesting thing is Japan is not a third world country or even a second world country. Japan is in all means and aspects an entirely modern country. So if you, for example, travel to some backwater city in India, or I don't know, Laos or Vietnam or what have you, you will have similar cultural elements, but it won't surprise you that much because they are not on a status like Western countries. But Japan is a country which technologically is on par with the best Western countries, and to many Western countries even superior. So that makes a strange expression that you travel essentially half of the globe, and then you meet a country which, by infrastructure, by technology level, and so far, is at least on par with Western countries, and with many even quite above, but still has so entirely different ways to socially interact. Now this sounds, if you read this or hear this, especially this aspect which is prevalent all over Asia, which is this idea of losing face. Now you must know about Asian culture in general, and this counts for Japan just the same. Asian cultures are not influenced by the book religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism. And one of the big differences, especially Christianity, but also Judaism and Islam, is Islam, Judaism, and Christianity introduced a morality system which was not existed in pagan times before, and that is the sin of feeling wrong. Now, I'm not about here to judge this. I'm just as a social scientist and as explaining it. For example, there is this parable of Jesus of, I suppose the English word is adultery, a person who cheats in marriage. I suppose it is called adultery. I'm not entirely certain. And there is the story of a woman in the New Testament where a woman commits adultery, like she cheats apparently on her husband, which is a sin in the Jewish religion, and then later on, similarly in the Christian and the Muslim religion, like that is, so to speak, a thought crime, a crime of emotion. And Jesus in this parable in the New Testament says, not only if you, I paraphrasing this in modern words, fuck with another man, you have committed a sin, but already if you desire another man, you have committed a sin. And this has greatly influenced Western morality. Like there is this idea that evil begins with thinking, with feeling, with desiring. And this is something that is entirely and totally alien to Asia, like to China, to I'm not certain about Korea in that aspect because they have been Christianized, but how far this changed the Korean cultures, I am not an expert. But in Japan, as well as in China, a sin in the moral sense can only be something which another person sees. And let's bring just one example. Homosexuality. Homosexual acts. A Japanese would never find it a sinful act to commit homosexual sex if nobody else sees it, or any other thing which is not harmful in the lawful way, like killing someone or robbing someone, of course. But there is this idea that if there is no victim, there is no crime. And if nobody sees it, there is no crime. So they have this culture of what you do in your own house with consenting people, whatever it is, it's nobody's business. Whereas on the other hand, there is the idea of morality in Western countries is quite the contrary. Like there is this idea that the Christian God sees you every time. He sees all you do. He knows, he can mind read, he knows all you think. And that is a concept entirely alien to Japan and Asian countries. Like they have their religion, their deities, though I must say the Japanese are not very religious people anyway. And they pray, if they pray at some holidays, they almost entirely pray for worldly things like winning the lottery or staying healthy or finding a love partner for life or something like that, finding a good job. For the Japanese, it would be entirely alien to pray for welfare of the soul or such abstract things. And so the morality is, it is this what we Westerners call losing face. So as long as you do something like, for instance, in Japan, like in almost all Asian countries, there are two fascinating things which are different from European countries. The men and the women, if there is evening and they go out, they almost all go separate. The women go out with the women and the men go out with the man. It has somewhat changed in recent years, but from what I back then and from what I heard today, it is still largely the case. So Japan is a very modern society in the case that women and men are working largely the equal jobs. So if you work, for instance, in an office or in a tech company, you have women and men working there. So there is no prejudice in the thing in Japan that women couldn't do something that men could do. They are, in that respect, in terms of gender, a relatively strong egalitarian society, partially because the women have to work just the same as the men have, for mostly economic reason, because living in Japan is extremely expensive. So Japan is a society where housewives are an extremely rare occurrence, partially or largely for economic reasons, of course, but also as a force of habit. The Japanese society never in the past had such a strong romanticism. Like European cultures are quite, or what the modern English word would be, simping. Like this, this is, European culture has this strong idea, or had, at least in the past, putting women on a pedestal, like women were made of porcelain and should thus be pampered. And this is not a thing that is generally all over the Orient, Muslim cultures, but also in non-Muslim Far Eastern cultures, it is a very rare idea that men think of women like something that needs to be pampered, up to the point of where, for me as a Westerner, it is a strange thing. And even me as a gay man, I still have this cultural thing, like there are things you do not say to a woman, that there are limits. I not regard myself as a person who's simping to women because I've no interest in women in any romantic or sexual ways. But nonetheless, still I have this cultural influence as a Westerner that there are things you do not say to a woman. So maybe it is because I'm an old-fashioned man who can say. Anyway, such restrictions do not in such a way exist in Japanese culture. Somewhat, but not strongly developed. So there are, in terms of gender, seem to be a more egalitarian society than most Western cultures, or much more even so to Eastern European cultures. So the women do their work shared just as much as the men do. Which leads to a little bit sad reality that children usually at a very early age are coming to kindergarten. Though I don't know very much about that topic to go to any lengths to speak about it. It's just an impression. But largely because living in Japan is extremely expensive. Going there on a holiday is certainly one of the most expensive holiday trips you can possibly make. And living in Japan is expensive for Japanese just the same. Anyway, where was I? So it is in terms of gender and it is in terms of age and relation. The Japanese define the role less through the individual merit, like who am I, what have I accomplished, but through the relation to the others. So how old is the person in front of me? For Japanese, it is very important to know how, if the person in front of you is older or younger, even if it is just 1 year. So if the person, especially in the younger time and era, if you are in school, if you are in college, in high school, their school system is largely modeled after the American system, which made it difficult for me to understand because the German school system is quite different from the American one and consequently from the Japanese one. I still do, to this day, am not quite familiar what a college is or a high school is because, as I said, our German education system is quite different. So, and even if you're just 1 year older, you are expected to treat your older senpai with great honor and honoring him and knowing that your role is, in some schools, even to serve him to a degree. And he can expect things like he can expect from you to carry his books or doing some of his duties or some such. And the school environment is probably one of the more dark aspects of Japanese cultures because, to be honest, it's something that I knew before and I haven't had any clear knowledge when I was there, of course, being way too old to know any people of that age. But Japan has, as a downside, a really high suicide rate because, especially in school, because of the differences between the ages, there is quite a considerable amount of mobbing. And it is quite hard for people to bear this. Most people who will go along with this do this with the idea, okay, next year I will be the senpais for the next younger generation and they will serve me just as I had to serve the older ones. And the Japanese will usually argue that it forms the character and society works like this and it is better to get used to it early on and learn to endure such hardships. And if you look at the extremely liberal, everything goes society in the West, especially how today these things have really gotten out of hand in Western societies, it is difficult to argue against this in this entirety. I've spoken to Japanese about this a few times, And I had the feeling back then, just the same as I have today, that I think that especially Japan and Europe could and should learn from another. Like the Western system and the Eastern system seem a little bit like extremes in such an aspect in social behavior between each other. Like the West is way too much over individualized. And if I remember my time spent in Japan, it's quite some years ago, but still, if I remember how it was, still I can't help to feel that Westerners largely are like children, like spoiled brats, so to speak. Because you see, when I was in Tokyo, Yokohama, when I was living there, and I more clearly realized it at my second half-year stay. I've never ever heard any parent yell at their child, and I've never ever heard children yelling loud, making a ruckus in public. And it's not because they beat the children or they're harsh to them. I've tried to find out what method they apply. One of them is which I read in a book, so I can't guarantee it is true, but loud children in kindergarten, because they're very early given away to kindergartens because women are quite expected and needed to work quite early, so they can't stay years at home or have a half-day job because it's financially not possible for married couples, usually in Japan, especially in the city areas. So in kindergarten, when a child is loud and misbehaves, the usual reaction from the other kids and from the pedagogues is they ignore the child until it stops. So if you act loud or unruly, you just become non-existent for the rest until you calm down. Now, some say that might be a little bit a cruel way to deal with children. Probably it is. I'm not an expert in child pedagogy, so don't ask me. But the result is that I have never heard children yelling, that I've never had parents yelling, and I can't remember having heard many people arguing and yelling in public at all, which is quite a remarkable thing then, since Tokyo, Yokohama is not only a large city, but it is also an extremely densely populated city. The streets of Yokohama and Tokyo at any time of the day are extremely thickly packed with people, partially of which probably is because the job situation in rural areas, I assume, must be quite bad. So in Japan, the vast majority, for many reasons, preferred to live in big cities, which in part has to do with the geography of Japan, of course, because there is not much rural space. And the interesting thing is, which is another thing which is quite contrasting, especially for a European, I'm not so certain how it is for an American, we Europeans tend to walk into nature which surrounds us. Now, there is an interesting thing. The Americans have a special word for this, which is called hiking. And if an American says he goes hiking, it means he made special preparing. And America is, relatively speaking, a quite thinly populated area. There are vast big cities, and there are vast, immense areas of lands where you can walk for weeks and not meet a single person, which is not the case in Europe. You can't hardly work an hour without meeting anyone, which is why Europe is quite densely populated. But we walk into nature as a small walk, as a big trip, and so our relation to walking in nature is quite normal would not be the right word, because what is normal here is not normal in other countries, but I suppose, or I hope you get the drift. In Japan, it is quite the opposite. Many of the forests, mountain areas, they have no paths. They have no roads, so you can't just walk into a forest. So there, I won't say wilderness, but they remain largely untouched, and there is maybe one road. And if the Japanese travel into rural areas, into the wildlife, so to speak, they always sit in their buses from the big cities, drive out hours and hours out into the landscape to one spot, and then they stay for, I don't know, an hour or two in that spot, but they never go too far away from the bus. Look a little bit around, so looking glasses, so cameras and so forth, and then they go back after an hour or two back on the bus and drive either to the next spot, which is usually the case, and then in the evening they drive home into their cities. So they do not stay in nature. They do not hike. They do not walk around in real nature in any way Americans or Europeans do. At least as far as I just take this all with a grain of salt, which is just my personal experience. But the forest looked all extremely untouched, shall we say. The Japanese love their nature. It's not to say that they have not an interest in the nature, but they prefer to stay away from it. It is probably something somewhat connected to their Shinto religion, because in Shinto religion, all things in nature is sacred, is alive, is filled with spirits, with gods. Though, as I said, I suppose the vast majority of Japanese do not hold these beliefs anymore, but it is ingrained in their culture nonetheless. Whereas for us, especially Europeans, making a walk into nature is a natural thing which we consider healthy and normal. So the Japanese, when they go make so-called trips, they just drive by bus to a certain spot and they spend there for an hour. For instance, I had the immense pleasure and honor to go to Mount Fuji-sama. The Mount Fuji is the great striking landmark of Honshu, and it is that great mountain which is a dormant volcano. And we were driving there by bus, so no Japanese would have the idea to go by bus to the foot of the mountain and then make a day-long climb up to this. No. They have a great parking lot on somewhere on the middle height of the Fuji-san. Fuji is the name of the mountain, that volcano thing, which is existing in so many Japanese iconography, photography, and paintings. So you drive to that large parking lot on somewhere in the middle height of Mount Fuji, and then you stay there, walk around, not too far, make some photos, stay there for an hour, buy your souvenirs, and well, then you drive back, which is a typical relation that the Japanese have to nature. They revere that nature, they love that nature, they really do. They have a very emotional, intimate relationship to the nature, but they do not stay there very long. Not so much because they lack the time, in part too because Japanese are expected to work quite long. They are quite exploited, I assume, in time of working overtime, and I do not know if it is paid overtime or not. This much I do not know, but the work ethic, the expectation to work ethics in Japan is extremely high. As I know from family relation, it is the same in South Korea. So I suppose it is something in many Asian countries to be expected. Or at least in these two I know it. But a lot of these things may sound very negative, I know. But if you are there, it does not feel like that. Now you see, Berlin, the city where I live, people are the most... No, I have to begin this a different way. Germans are known among the Europeans to be the most outspoken. So if a German has a mood, he will let you know. And Berlin is, I don't know, 10 times stronger like this. So Berlin is really a rude city where everyone will speak every mood and every aggression and every feeling, especially the negative ones, directly in your face without any second thought. Now, I live in Berlin for, let me think, about 42 or 43 years. So I'm 49 now. So I'm quite used to it. And I'm not that much an outspoken person like the typical Berliner. Partially because I'm a more conservative person, partially because there is still this Swabian South German politeness which dominates me. So whatever the reason is, so it was still a culture shock to return to Berlin, which after spending so much time in Japan, because no one is yelling at you. If you go into the densely packed bus or train or tube, which is the underground in American language, or any place where it is packed full of people, no one will push his elbows in your side, no one will yell you make space or any such thing. Nobody will raise his voice, because raising your voice is something considered to be extremely unpolite. It would mean, as I said, lose your face. And Japanese learn to control their emotion, not to the degree like static volcans, but in a way somewhat like that. And now that sounds quite strenuous, quite stressful, but the reality is, I had this image before I was in Japan for the first time too. Oh God, always this self-control, always having to be a face and always forced to be polite in order to be not a persona non grata. But the reality is, on the other hand, it makes you feel unbelievably relaxed. If you offer someone in the bus or in the train your place, or in the underground, you know the next person will do this to you. So all the polite, you are quite, within 2 days, I was slipping in this politeness mode just the same, and it felt so relaxing. You know, in Japan, the politeness that you practice is reciprocated towards you just the same. So whereas living in Berlin and living in, I suppose, many American and Western cities is a little bit like a social battleground, like for every meter you walk, for everything you want to buy, for every place in the bus or in the train, you feel like in a war. It is not so in Japan. And that makes things... After 2 or 3 days, I felt so relaxed. I felt so at ease. Like I had never before and since felt in my life. And given it is such a densely hectic city, this is really extraordinary. Where you expect and know that densely populated cities with many busy people in Germany, in England, in Spain, in America. Well, I never was in America. I know America only from many descriptions from quite a lot of American friends. But it is quite the opposite in Japan. It is such a calm environment. Despite the hectic, people are busy there. People who go to work are walking fast, so they are in a hurry, of course. But this politeness is so clearly given and taken that I felt so relaxed like nowhere else in the world before or thereafter. Which is and especially this is one of the main reasons which I considerably miss Japan. Now, it has, of course, a downside. In a funny way, you can see this if you watch anime, especially slice of life anime. Anime is, for those who don't know, essentially the Japanese version of animated comics, so to speak, if you really need to have it broken down to some who haven't heard of it. It is a very different culture, and while it is an exaggeration, of course, like all cartoons and so forth are, if you look at it, especially those who are displaying everyday life, like in office, in work, in personal relationship, in school, or what have you, then there is Japanese, and I realized this in the real life meeting with Japanese just the same. Japanese have quite a strong aversion to telling others how they feel about something. Telling others too much how you feel is largely regarded as rude, like forcing another person to know your feeling. And this leads to people in Japan often wasting years and lifetimes not getting to the point, where sometimes I sat there besides and thought, why don't you just tell him and solve the matter? So it is all its ups and downs. And of course, I remember when I was in Japan, both in my shorter holiday 2003 and in my long stay in 2006, I had an ambivalent feeling towards the idea to living in Japan. You know, Japan is a very, very safe and very clean society. Like, I just had recently my bicycle stolen, which was an extraordinary emotional trauma for me. For one, I live from social welfare and a little bit financial support from others. So for me, I had not used a bicycle for many reasons for 15 years or so. So my physical health was quite at a low, and my mobility was likewise. And I thought, okay, I want to change my life. So I was buying a bicycle. And to really symbolize a cut for the better in my life, I bought myself the best I could afford, which was a bicycle for €450. And it was in my favorite color, light blue. And it was called Pegasus, which all these things was like my bike. I'm getting back to Japan. Have a little bit of patience with me. And after not even a year, after 11 months, the bike was stolen. And more than the tremendous loss of money, and more than the emotional, devastating impact that I had lacked, I was losing my mobility, and I by myself could not afford another bike unless I was buying some really shoddy, rusty piece of trash. And it was really one of the joys of my life to have this bicycle. In Japan, if you have a bike, or if you forget your pocket purse somewhere, or anything, you have a 90.9% probability that someone will bring it back to you. Even if you forget to tie down your bike, and it will stay there. It will stay there. Or if you forget it and move on, someone will bring it to the police and you will get it back. So I'm not saying that there is no crime in Japan. Of course there is crime, like there is in every society. But the probability in Japan that an average person in an average area is becoming the victim of a crime is so unbelievably low because of that losing face morality. And of this strong, shall we say, collective ethicality which the Japanese own. And of course, part of it, a strong part of it, I must say, and this will be something that a lot of people will not very fond of hearing. But I have to say this both as a historian, as a social scientist, identity is one of my specialities, so I can claim that is something I am a professional about. And Japan is one of the most ethnically homogeneous societies that you can possibly imagine. And the part that Japanese is an extremely expensive country, there are very, very, very few people making holiday in Japan. Koreans make sometimes now holiday in Japan, and also likewise Japanese make holidays in Korea, despite their troubled history together. In recent decades they have, I will not say left this behind, because Japan acted quite cruelly with Korea during the time of World War II and before, but they recognized that there are similarities of their culture and their political and also economic and military interests, especially in the face of the giant confrontation of China, has brought them closer together. And as I said, their cultures have quite some similarities. Even the language, I know not much about Korean, but when I listen to Korean and I listen to manhwa, which is Korean language, usually manhwa is manga, like just the comic. But I have heard some, I don't know if they're called manhwa too or some other name, but I have heard Korean more often in recent years. And if you listen to Korean, it has quite a similar in sound to Japanese. So a little bit like a mixture of Chinese and Japanese. It's just a foreigner's observation, which might be entirely inaccurate, but I'm getting beside the point. So from a foreigner's perspective, being in Japan, I was to 99% seeing only Japanese. Now, of course, this may not be entirely accurate. There may have been Koreans, there may have been even Chinese, though I would assume that by today I have a probability to see the difference between a Chinese and a Japanese, because they're not looking so much the same as they do from a Western eye at first. Can't say you in what way, it's more something intuitive. But I know that in Japan, the overwhelming, almost all people you will ever meet in Japan are Japanese. And one of the anecdotal experiences I can describe this is when I saw a black person, and I was really astonished. Oh, there is someone non-Japanese like me. Okay, in the biggest tourist attractions, you see a few white people. Most of them are Americans, so Europeans are very, very, very rare in Japan. So I would say 90% of the white people I saw were probably Americans, or maybe Canadians or Australians, I don't know. so from the Anglosphere. So even there were very rarely. When I was walking around or traveling around in Tokyo and Yokohama, I could drive around days and days and days, and I was the only white person I've ever saw. And just once it was so, wow, there is a black person, there is a non-Japanese person like me. So I never spoke to him, of course. It was just a person that I saw. He was probably American too, I would assume. But Japan is extremely homogeneous, and the Japanese ways of dealing with each other are so codified, shall we say, that from what I heard, and some Japanese have told me, if you are a Japanese and you spend 1, 2 or 3 years in Europe or in America for, say, job reasons, then you are regarded as almost non-reintegratable into Japanese society. And it was sadly so with my friend back then. He had stayed, I suppose, 2 or 3 years in Germany, and it was almost impossible to slide back into this very regulated way of dealing with people. And he was a very shy, a very timid. He was not outspoken, loud, or by any means. He was a very shy, even for Japanese standards, a reserved person. But he had seen and experienced strong individualism in Germany. I suppose he also was a short time in America. And for him, going back to Japan was a very hard time. He never got really into it. Though being a strong introvert, I suppose all his life he had difficulties to integrate with other people. So I'm not sure how far this is a representative observation. But I have heard and read this several times, that Japanese stayed abroad for a year or more are very suspiciously regarded by Japanese, because the vast majority of Japanese never leaves Japan for anything but a 1-week holiday. The overwhelming majority of Japanese make holiday within Japan, because they know what they get and they know the rules. And Japanese rules are very, I won't say strict, but you have to be Japanese to really understand them. And the other thing is, which I read a lot of time about non-Japanese, especially Westerners moving to Japan, the Japanese are extremely friendly, but there is a limit of, I even knew the Japanese word back then, I'm not entirely sure. The word means something like in-house. And when you are a foreigner, you can live there 10 years, 15 years, but you will never entirely regarded to be one of them. Not that they will be mean to you or rude to you, but you will always be seen as a gaijin, as a foreigner. Which is a logical thing to expect in a country where, I don't know, 99.9% of all the people in Japan you will ever see are Japanese. And they rarely ever travel abroad unless, say, there's 10 days holiday to America or to Europe. And even then they don't spend much time in the same place like we would do, like if I travel to, I don't know, some place in Bavaria or some place in France. Usually I would stay for 2 weeks in that one place and learn this one place very thoroughly. No, they go to one city and then stay in the city for a day, and they go on the bus and they travel to another city and another and take quick photos. So Japanese don't have seem to have this habit to really connect with the places abroad to which they make holidays. So for them, it's just more like sightseeing. Like they travel there, they look at all the people, and they're all very friendly and polite. And they have an intellectual interest in it, but they do not want to connect emotionally to them. So that too contributes to this perception that Japan is virtually feels or felt to me like visiting another planet. Now, the thing I love about the Japanese, it sounds a little bit negative, which is not what I intended. One of the things which I really love in Japan is it is a very clean country. You will never see litter. You will never see dirt in the streets. The idea that a Japanese just drops litter on the road, in the bushes, on the greenery is absolutely unthinkable. And such a person would really, I don't know, I never saw this. Or I can't remember to have ever seen graffiti, like people dirting the walls by painting something upon it. And so many of these small details made Japan such a wonderful country. And of course they preserved their old times castles and shrines and temples and parks and what have you, and they really love these old places, and there's so many beautiful things. One of the most stunning things, it must have been really super expensive. I'm still ashamed. I was, in that age, I was naive and couldn't really comprehend how expensive it was, how I was treated. But I remember I was in downtown Tokyo, on top of a skyscraper, on the topmost floor, essentially on the roof, and there was an onsen. An onsen is a hot bath. And just let me tell you, the water of an onsen is really borderline hot. It's so hot that you think if you dropped, I don't know, a lobster, you could eat him after half an hour. If you would be in eating lobsters, which personally I'm not. Anyway, it is unbelievably, it is borderline bearably hot, but it has a very relaxing effect, and bathing, especially going to onsens, hot baths, is a very popular thing for Japanese to do. And you must imagine it was a really tall skyscraper, quite in the middle of buzzing Tokyo, and there is a hot bath, and you can look down, it was in the night, you can look down, it was full, busy, you can look down at the illuminated skyline of Tokyo below you. And this was an unforgettable experience. And back then I had no idea. Today I know that it was probably one of the most expensive things that this family had ever spent to me. And I'm quite ashamed that I did not properly thank them. I was still too much in a European mindset, and in a German and in a Berlin mindset, probably. Much to my endless shame even today. The Japanese are very proud of these things, what they have. Their cooking also, which was quite how shall I say it, a big embarrassment for me, because the reality is I don't like seafood at all, and Japanese cooking is full of seafood. And Japanese food looks extraordinarily beautiful, but I cannot tell you why I found the taste of almost all of it deeply revolting. And it was a very hard time, so I was eating most of the time as much as I could Western food, which I know in hindsight was probably quite a deeply impolite and disrespectful thing to do, because the Japanese are extremely proud of their cooking, but I just couldn't stomach it, most of it. Anyway, there would be a million of anecdotes about things which I experienced in Japan, but especially the orderliness, the calmness, the way of Japanese people to be polite, to not be slave of childish emotions, shall we say, in such a way. And especially when I look at the last, let's say, 3 or 4 years, how European and American people behave, it feels like, if I remember my time in Japan, I have this feeling that Europeans and Americans are extremely immature, childish people. I do not aim to slander white people through this, and I know that in Asia there are countries which are not like this, because I've not a very fond opinion of China, I'm sorry to say. Of course, such things can never be generalized. There are mean Japanese people and there are friendly Chinese people, but there are general trends in culture, and since Japan is an isolated insular country, of course, with stronger homogeneity, cultural and racial, than maybe all other countries in the world, especially if you go to highly developed countries. And it makes me miss Japan. I mean, I know I like to speak about how I feel, so really living in Japan would probably something I could not do. It is why I said to my friend back then several times, it would be beneficial to both the people from Japan in general, in particular, but also the people of some Asian culture and the Western culture, to learn from each other. Like the Western countries to become more socially mature. And on the other hand, maybe the Japanese should learn a little bit to be more individualistic, more open to listen to the emotions of others, which is quite a difficulty in Japanese society. So I've spoken quite longer about my experiences about Japan than I intended. I thought it would be a half-hour audio file. I hope I did not bore you too much. No matter if you liked what I say or disliked what I say, I'm very thankful if you listened to this point. I would be very interested about your comments, especially if you are Japanese yourselves, if you have also, of course, experiences in Japan or experiences in other Asian countries about that topic. That was generally what I wanted to say about my thoughts and experience about Japanese culture. Thanks quite a lot for listening.